How far would you go to uncover a betrayal that haunts you in the dead of night? My name is Emily Harper. I'm 33 years old, and I live on Sycamore Lane in Willow Creek, Colorado. Just a few months ago, I believed I had the perfect life: an adoring husband, a cozy suburban house, and a future that looked blissful from the outside. But that was before I discovered the nightmarish secrets lurking behind our picket fence. It all began on a sweltering summer night, when I found myself huddled by the stairs at 3 a.m, listening to hushed voices coming from our living room. My heart hammered so loudly that I wondered if Mark could hear it through the walls. His words were gentle, filled with a softness that once belonged only to me. Yet as I strained to hear, a cold sweat blanketed my skin, because I realized I wasn't the one on the other end of that call. Every sentence he spoke felt like a stab to my chest, each syllable forcing me to reconsider everything I thought I knew. The echoes of his conversation twisted in my mind, painting horrifying possibilities I wasn't ready to face. I should have confronted him that very moment, but something inside me froze. My hand clutched the banister, and I felt trapped, like a prisoner in my own home, forced to learn the truth piece by piece. When Mark finally hung up and climbed the stairs, I pretended to be asleep. He slid into bed, oblivious to my wide-open eyes. A flash of doubt rippled through me. Maybe I had misheard. Maybe it was just a late-night call with a troubled student from the high school where he worked. I wanted to believe that so badly, but deep down, I already knew. A quiet storm of betrayal brewed, promising to shake the foundations of everything I held dear. In the days that followed, I plastered on a smile for the neighbors and tried to ignore the tightness in my chest. People in Willow Creek often remarked on how lucky I was to be married to Mark, the kind, devoted high school counselor. They saw him cheering at community events, volunteering at the church fundraiser, and joking around at weekend barbecues. To them, he was the picture-perfect husband. Their compliments turned to daggers in my mind. If they only knew what I had heard in the middle of the night. Each time someone mentioned how charming he was, my stomach churned with bitter irony. On the outside, we looked like an all-American couple with no problems. On the inside, I felt the cracks spreading, and fear pulsed through me like a heartbeat. I decided to keep my discovery hidden at first. Admitting the truth meant dismantling the life I'd built. I wasn't ready to watch our marriage crumble. I wasn't ready to become the woman who lost her husband. It was easier to paint over the cracks with forced laughter and small talk. But the longer I pretended, the worse it got. I couldn't keep living like a stranger in my own home, trapped in the shadows of Mark's secrets. Something had to give, and I worried that if I waited too long, I'd lose my chance to free myself from this spiraling nightmare. Yet I never could have guessed just how deep his betrayal ran, or the dangerous lengths I'd go to uncover the truth. But the next step I took would show me that I was in far deeper than I ever imagined. The days after that haunting phone call felt painfully normal to anyone looking in. Mark and I still took our usual evening walks, waving cheerfully at our neighbors and pausing to chat about the weather. He continued to cook breakfast on Saturdays, scrambled eggs with bacon, exactly the way I liked. If I had told anyone about my suspicions, they would have laughed. Mark was the doting husband with a constant smile and warm demeanor. Nobody would believe the dread settling into my bones, yet small threads began to unravel. One night, I came home from work a bit later than expected and found him pacing in the kitchen with the lights off. The second I opened the door, he forced a grin, but his eyes were wild, like he'd been in an argument with himself. "I was worried about you," he said, voice tight. "Next time, text me if you're going to stay late." Something felt off in the way he stared at me, as though he was searching my face for any hint of knowledge I shouldn't have. Even his concern felt staged, like an actor reciting lines in a poorly rehearsed play. I tried not to flinch, but my pulse pounded faster. Over time, he developed this uncanny habit of commenting on my memory. If I mentioned something about meeting my sister, he'd swear I never told him. Whenever I misplaced small items, my phone charger, the spare car key, he was always the one to find them, shaking his head in sympathy as if I were losing my mind. "Babe, are you sure you're feeling okay?" became his catchphrase whenever I questioned him about anything. It made me second-guess each moment of my day. I started scribbling notes on sticky pads to ensure I wasn't actually forgetting things. More than once, I found those sticky notes crumpled in the trash, and I couldn't explain how they got there. It wasn't just the memory games that put me on edge. He'd also perfected subtle put-downs cloaked in kindness. He'd tilt his head, offer a sweet smile, and say, "You know I love you, but you've been acting so stressed. Maybe you need a break." Sometimes I wondered if I truly was too stressed. Other times I worried that maybe, just maybe, he was gaslighting me, manipulating the very ground I stood on until I couldn't trust my own footing. Deep down, I hated how powerless I felt, but I also recognized I wasn't quite ready to face him. The shame of admitting I might be in a toxic marriage swallowed me. After all, I came from a family that prized stability and loyalty above all else. Telling them I had stumbled into a nightmare wasn't easy. My mother used to say, "Always give your loved ones the benefit of the doubt." And that phrase repeated in my head, pushing me to ignore every warning sign. Meanwhile, the tension in our home solidified like concrete around my ankles, and each day it got harder to breathe. But I couldn't keep ignoring those late-night calls, the hushed whispers, and the secret texts. One slip would soon expose the truth, and part of me was terrified it would break me beyond repair. Still, I felt a glimmer of determination flicker to life in my chest. Something told me that once I pulled on the right thread, his entire facade would unravel, and when it did, I'd have a chance to reclaim my life. I just didn't know how fast everything would come crashing down, and so I waited, unaware of the avalanche of revelations about to bury me. Late one evening, I decided to peek at Mark's phone. My palms were clammy, and my heartbeat roared in my ears as I finally gathered the courage to do it. I'd always respected his privacy, but his evasive behavior left me no choice. He had stepped out to buy groceries, giving me a small window of time. I paced around the living room, rehearsing the right excuse if he walked in suddenly. At last, I tiptoed into our bedroom, found his phone charging on the nightstand, and unlocked it. My stomach churned with guilt and fear, but curiosity drove me forward. Most of his recent messages seemed innocent. Reminders from the dentist, group chats with coworkers about the next school event. But then I found a conversation tucked away under a disguised contact name. C. Martin. The messages were short and cryptic at first. Words like "can't wait," "miss you," and "same spot tomorrow" flashed before my eyes. Each phrase sliced a fresh wound of betrayal across my heart. I scrolled back further and felt my blood freeze at a picture of Mark and another woman, arms around each other in a pose that suggested more than a casual acquaintance. Her face was partially hidden, but her hair was unmistakably long and golden. They stood in a dimly lit room, both smiling in a way that made my legs feel weak. Just as I was about to screenshot the messages, I heard the front door open. Panic seized me. I fumbled with the phone, closed the app, and tossed it onto the bed, trying to look casual as Mark's footsteps approached. He walked in with a grocery bag in each arm, eyes immediately darting to his phone. For a second, our gazes locked. My breath caught, but I forced myself to greet him. "Hey, you're back early," I said, grabbing one of the bags to help. He didn't say anything, but his stare lingered on me like a silent warning. Then, he plastered on a grin and pretended not to notice how I trembled. The rest of that evening, I felt like a thief caught red-handed. He didn't bring up anything about his phone, yet tension crackled between us as we unloaded groceries and prepared dinner. I kept expecting him to question me, to accuse me of prying into his life, but he said nothing. Instead, he hummed absent-mindedly as he chopped vegetables, every now and then casting suspicious glances my way. I answered them with forced smiles, determined not to let him see the panic in my eyes. That night, I lay awake with my mind spinning in 1,000 directions. The evidence was right there. He was meeting someone else, whispering promises of "miss you" and "soon." I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation. But a small voice in my head told me to wait. If I confronted him now, he'd just twist it around and make me doubt my own eyes. If I was smart about this, I could gather more proof, build a case he couldn't explain away. The thought gave me a sense of control, fragile though it was. Still, the knowledge burned inside me, forcing my lungs to work harder for each breath. I had proof, but also a hollow dread that my life was about to implode. And in the depths of my shaking resolve, I vowed that if Mark was going to betray me this shamelessly, I would be the one to rip off his mask for everyone to see. Little did I know, the betrayal reached far beyond a simple affair. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. My eyes stared at spreadsheets, but my mind hovered around those messages and the snapshot of Mark with that mysterious woman. During lunch, I slipped into an empty conference room and tried to call my sister, but my phone only rang to voicemail. I almost spilled everything to the beep, but I stopped myself. My voice cracked too much, and I felt tears threatening to roll down my cheeks. So I texted her a short, vague note. Need to talk, it's about Mark, it's bad, call me. Sending it felt like shouting into a void. But at least I wasn't shouldering the burden alone anymore. When I returned home that evening, I found Mark cooking pasta in the kitchen, an apron tied neatly around his waist, like the perfect husband from a TV commercial. He smiled when I walked in, then placed a glass of wine on the counter. Rough day, he asked, voice dripping with false kindness. My guard shot up. He had never offered me wine on a weekday before, and something about this sudden generosity felt staged. Still, I sipped it, wondering if I was overreacting. After all, he was just being thoughtful, right? But it didn't take long for the tone to shift. As we ate, he began casually asking about my day, prying into tiny details. Which coworkers I met, how long my lunch break lasted, why I looked so stressed. Then, in the middle of dinner, he paused and stared at me with an unnerving intensity. You know, Em, sometimes I worry about your mental state, he said, feigning concern. You've been forgetting things more often. And lately, you seem suspicious, like you're scared. My appetite vanished. I pushed my plate away and folded my arms. I'm just tired, I muttered, not wanting to give him any ammunition. Inside, my outrage flared. He was trying to turn the tables on me, planting seeds that I was mentally unwell. I swallowed my anger, deciding not to argue. The more I tried to defend myself, the more he'd twist my words. After dinner, I retreated to the bedroom under the pretense of having a headache. I locked the door and stared at my reflection in the mirror. Could I still recognize the person staring back? My eyes were tinged with exhaustion, and my shoulders sagged under the weight of my secrets. There was no denying that Mark was playing a psychological game, and it was working. He wanted me to second-guess every thought, to feel guilty for even suspecting him. That night, I fell asleep with my phone clutched in my hand, hoping my sister would call back, longing for a scrap of support or validation. The next morning, I discovered an envelope slipped under our front door. Inside was a single printed photo, Mark and that same blonde woman locked in a passionate kiss, time-stamped just 3 days ago. My breath caught in my throat and my hands shook. A sticky note was attached, reading, "He's not who you think he is. Keep your eyes open." My stomach lurched. Whoever left this had gone out of their way to warn me. Were they a friend or an enemy? Did they want to help me or drive me over the edge? Mark was still asleep upstairs, so I stuffed the envelope into my purse and scrambled to think. If someone else knew about his affair, maybe it wasn't just me who had been kept in the dark. But I also wondered what other skeletons he might be hiding, and how long this had been going on. I felt trapped in a twisted labyrinth, with every turn revealing more confusion and fear. Yet a spark of resilience lit up inside me. I could let this break me, or I could use it to gather more proof and plan my next move. One thing was certain. I was no longer alone in my suspicions. The world around me was about to close in on Mark's lies. I just didn't realize how wide that circle of betrayal truly stretched. Within a week, the entire atmosphere in our house changed. Mark sensed my growing distance and tried to tighten his grip. He insisted on driving me to work, picking me up, and monitoring my schedule with an eerie intensity. Each evening, he hovered over me like a watchful shadow, as if worried I might discover something he'd buried too deep. My sister finally called, leaving a voicemail that said, "Em, I got your message. I'm calling you all night. Pick up." Her voice shook with urgency and fear. I knew I had to reach her, but Mark's presence made it nearly impossible to talk without him eavesdropping. One Friday, I pretended to work late, but I actually snuck off to a nearby cafe to call my sister. When she picked up, I poured out everything, his lies, the suspicious messages, the photo left under my door, and how I felt I was spiraling out of control. Laura listened quietly, then told me she had overheard rumors about Mark's affair from one of her old college friends who lived in Willow Creek. Apparently, people were talking behind my back, but nobody had the guts to tell me directly. The humiliation burned my face. All those polite smiles in the neighborhood had been covering whispered gossip. But the worst was yet to come. Laura mentioned that our parents might be hiding something. She didn't have details, only that Dad had once hinted Mark wasn't as honorable as he appeared. Why hadn't anyone warned me earlier? I stepped out of the cafe with my heart racing, determined to confront my parents and find out what they knew. My mother's phone went straight to voicemail, so I tried Dad's number. He picked up on the second ring, voice calm but oddly guarded. "Emily, we should talk in person," he said quietly. "Stop by tomorrow if you can. Please don't bring Mark." My blood turned cold. The fact that Dad, who always welcomed Mark with open arms, now insisted he stay away, told me something huge was brewing. After all those years of praising Mark as the best husband, Dad's sudden shift rattled me. That evening, I returned home to find Mark rummaging through my purse with a frantic desperation. The moment he saw me, he straightened up, clearing his throat as if nothing had happened. My pulse quickened in anger. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded, my voice low and trembling. He tried to laugh it off, claiming he was just looking for a spare pen. I snatched my purse away, feeling invaded and furious. The tension between us was now thick as tar, suffocating any hint of harmony. I locked myself in the bathroom under the guise of taking a shower, counting the hours until I could slip away and confront my father. A storm of fear and betrayal swirled inside me, and for the first time, I truly feared what Mark might do if he realized just how close I was to unraveling his secrets. Little did I know, my next step would force open doors that had been sealed for years, exposing a network of lies that ran deeper than a simple affair. And once opened, those doors refused to close. The following morning, I drove to my parents' place. They lived an hour away in a small town near the foothills, where I'd grown up in a quiet, old farmhouse. Memories of simpler times flashed through my mind as I turned off the main road, following the winding gravel path to the home I'd once loved. Dad stood on the porch, arms folded, staring out at the horizon. His posture was rigid, and the moment I stepped out of the car, he waved me inside with a solemn nod. Inside, the house smelled faintly of fresh coffee and the pine-scented air freshener Mom always used. She was nowhere in sight, but I could hear muffled whispers coming from the living room. Dad guided me into the kitchen and offered me a seat at the old oak table. I tried to steady my racing heart. "What's going on, Dad?" I managed to ask, voice catching in my throat. He hesitated, then finally sat down across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "We never wanted you to find out this way," he said, eyes downcast. "But I can't keep quiet anymore." My hands twisted in my lap as I braced myself for a confession. To my shock, Dad admitted he'd always disliked Mark. At first, he tolerated him because I seemed so happy. But over time, he'd heard rumors of Mark's past, stories about manipulation, controlling behavior, even hush money Mark's own father had paid to keep certain allegations quiet. My father had tried to investigate, but every lead was buried, courtesy of Mark's father, a wealthy figure with influence in Willow Creek. Dad pressed my mother to say something, but she refused, fearing it would destroy my marriage, so they stayed silent, hoping the gossip was just that. Yet as the rumors grew, Dad became convinced Mark was dangerous. He tried to confront Mark's father, only to be threatened with a lawsuit if he ever spoke a word about it. Every sentence Dad spoke felt like ice water poured over my skin. I wanted to scream, to demand why I hadn't been warned earlier. Rage and betrayal warred in my chest, tears stinging my eyes. How could my own parents allow me to marry a man they suspected might ruin me? Dad's face was pained as he explained that they wanted to protect me from heartbreak, praying that Mark had changed. I rose from my chair, nearly tipping it over. My voice trembled with fury as I asked, "Protect me by letting me step into a trap? By letting me find out alone?" Before Dad could answer, Mom emerged from the living room, face tear-streaked, and tried to apologize. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. My whole world spun. I felt betrayed not only by Mark, but by my own family for failing to shield me. The secrets and lies were deeper than I'd ever imagined, swirling together in a toxic brew. It was the final straw. I couldn't just walk away anymore. I needed to take back control of my life, even if it meant burning every bridge that bound me to my lying husband. So I left my parents' house with a bitter sense of resolve, fueled by the knowledge of Mark's hidden, treacherous lineage and the hush money that had kept his sins under wraps for far too long. I drove back home gripping the steering wheel, numb from shock and heartbreak, but also burning with anger. Mark's entire life was built on deceit. I intended to bring it all crashing down, no matter the cost. That evening, I made the decision to confront Mark directly, armed with everything I knew. I crafted a plan to expose his betrayal in a way he couldn't deny. After dinner, I calmly told him I wanted to talk. He looked surprised by my measured tone. Usually, he was the one controlling when we had serious discussions. We sat across from each other in the living room, the only light coming from a single floor lamp. The rest of the house was dark, shadows dancing across the walls like silent witnesses to what was about to happen. I started by asking a simple question. Were you ever going to tell me about your father's hush money? His expression went from puzzled to panicked in an instant. I saw his throat bob as he swallowed. I don't know what you're talking about, he mumbled, eyes darting away from mine. My blood simmered, but I kept my voice level. My dad told me everything. About how your father paid people off to keep your secrets from going public. The women, the allegations, the mess you left behind before we got married. Mark shot up from his chair, face contorted with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at me, as if hoping intimidation would silence me. Don't you dare accuse me of that nonsense, he spat. You've been brainwashed by your father's lies. But I was done letting him manipulate me. In response, I pulled out the printed photo from my purse, the one of him kissing another woman, and slapped it onto the coffee table. Is this also a lie? I asked, voice rising. Because this looks pretty real to me, Mark. He stared at it, and for a second, I saw the color drain from his face. It was the look of someone caught in the act, stripped of any defense. Yet he made one last attempt to twist the situation, his voice trembling with a desperate edge. It was just a moment of weakness. She's a co-worker, but it didn't mean anything, he lied, face twitching. It's not what it looks like, my temper flared, and tears blurred my vision. Stop lying, I shouted, slamming my fist on the table. The lamp flickered, and the living room felt like a stage set for a final showdown. Your father can't protect you from this. I have more photos, more messages, and I'll tell everyone if I have to. I will not live another day under your control. His chest heaved, and he took a step toward me. I tensed, but kept my ground. The old fear threatened to choke me, but my anger burned hotter. In that moment, I realized if I didn't stand up for myself now, I never would. Suddenly, my phone buzzed, and I saw my sister's name flash on the screen. Mark glanced at it, and I saw pure fury in his eyes. Who are you calling? He snapped. Before I could answer, I felt him lunge for my phone, but I jerked away. Don't touch me, I yelled, my voice echoing through the room. The entire confrontation was spiraling into dangerous territory. In the pit of my stomach, I knew it was time to end this once and for all. I refused to break under the weight of his lies and intimidation, even if it meant risking my safety. As he stood there, breathing heavily, I locked eyes with him. This marriage is over, I declared, stepping back toward the door. I'm giving you one chance to leave peacefully, or I will destroy every bit of your carefully built life. The words tasted bitter, but they also lit a spark of relief inside me. Mark let out a low growl, as though he wanted to lash out. Instead, he slammed his fist on the coffee table, shattering the photo frame, sending shards of glass across the floor. You'll regret this, he hissed. But I was already slipping out the door, determined to save myself from the man who had long ago lost the right to call me his wife. Little did he know, my next move would unleash a storm of consequences he wouldn't see coming. Leaving Mark didn't mean I was safe, but it felt like I could finally breathe without his shadow over me. My first stop was my friend Heather's place. She was expecting me and had set up the guest room as a temporary haven. Just crossing her threshold felt like stepping onto solid ground for the first time in ages. We stayed up late, going over my plan to reveal everything about Mark and his father's hush money. Heather was appalled and insisted we gather all the proof we could. Texts, photos, emails, anything that would make his lies impossible to deny. Meanwhile, Mark bombarded my phone with messages ranging from tearful pleas to angry threats. One minute, he claimed he'd change if I just came home. The next, he raged that I was destroying his life. I blocked him, but he found ways around it. New phone numbers, emails from unknown addresses. It was draining, yet I felt a grim satisfaction that my departure had knocked him off balance. I wanted him to know fear, the way I'd been forced to live for so long. Heather contacted a local attorney who specialized in high-conflict divorces. The lawyer listened to my story in stunned silence, then methodically listed our legal options. We discussed restraining orders, collecting alimony, and most importantly, how to safely finalize a divorce without giving Mark room to manipulate the narrative. The attorney also hinted that going public with Mark's duplicity might be wise if it helped me gain leverage, but warned it would likely set him off even more. I took a breath, steeling myself for the chaos that might ensue. My goal wasn't vengeance for the sake of hurting him. I just needed enough of a spotlight on him that he couldn't quietly buy his way out or twist the story against me. Yet as the clock ticked, an unexpected call came from my father. He sounded anxious, explaining that Mark's father had reached out with a thinly veiled threat. If I dared to publicize Mark's affair or any family secrets, they'd sue me for defamation. I felt my pulse spike in anger. He was still using money and power to bully me? That only convinced me further that I had to see this through. We arranged a meeting at my parents' house the next day, promising to figure out how to navigate these looming legal threats. When I hung up, my knees trembled, and a wave of uncertainty washed over me. Mark's father had the resources to make my life miserable in court. But I had the truth and the moral high ground, two things money couldn't buy. My phone buzzed again with another voicemail from Mark, but I deleted it without listening. I couldn't allow him to rattle me anymore. Heather hugged me tight, offering words of encouragement. She reminded me that I wasn't alone and that I had every right to defend my freedom. I tried to sleep that night, but questions kept rattling in my head. Was I ready for the fury Mark and his father would unleash once I shared my evidence? Would the people of Willow Creek stand by my side? Or would they cower before the family's influence? My heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination. I had begun this war the moment I walked out the door, and there was no turning back. By morning, I had decided. I would stand my ground. Even if Mark and his powerful father came after me, I refused to return to living in the shadows of their lies. What I didn't realize was that this battle would bring both heartbreak and an unexpected victory I never saw coming. The next afternoon found me in my parents' living room once again, this time with my mother, father, sister, and an unexpected guest, my Aunt Karen, who apparently had her own story to tell. Her face wore a grim expression as she gripped a folder brimming with documents. Dad introduced her with a somber nod, saying she'd come forward with even more damning evidence about Mark's father. My aunt had once worked for him as a personal assistant, and during that time, she had seen hush money checks written to multiple individuals. Some were women who accused Mark of emotional or physical harm. Others were people who threatened to reveal shady financial deals. Each check was carefully hidden under shell accounts and coded transactions. As she laid out the papers across the coffee table, my throat tightened. The scale of the deceit was enormous, stretching beyond my crumbling marriage into a web of corruption that spanned years. I felt a surge of white-hot anger. How many other lives had been silenced or ruined? How many other families had this twisted father-son duo manipulated into submission? My father placed a hand on my shoulder, and I realized we finally had the upper hand. The truth was no longer just a rumor. It was documented, tangible, and devastating. That same evening, I filed an emergency protective order against Mark. The judge, seeing the evidence of harassment and the potential for further harm, granted it immediately. Mark was furious. He fired off emails threatening to expose my family for meddling. But with the new documentation from my aunt, it was clear who the real liars were. I felt a weight lift from my chest when the order was served. Mark was legally bound to keep his distance, and his father's influence couldn't magically wipe that away. For the first time in weeks, I breathed freely, though I knew the fight wasn't done yet. Working with my attorney, I decided to make a strategic move. We drafted a public statement outlining Mark's affair, the pattern of gaslighting, and the hush money records. I intended to release it on social media and send it to the local news outlets. The attorney double-checked that everything was factual and verifiable, ensuring we couldn't be countersued for libel. My hand trembled as I hovered over the post button, but Heather and Laura stood behind me, giving me a reassuring nod. With a single click, I set off a chain reaction that no one could contain. Within hours, the post went viral in our community. Neighbors who once adored Mark seemed aghast, flooding my inbox with messages of support or disbelief. Some apologized for not stepping in sooner, while others were too stunned to speak. Mark's father, blindsided by the public outcry, tried to intimidate local media, but the story only gained more traction. Eventually, even statewide news picked it up, especially when more of Mark's previous victims came forward with their own stories. It was as though a dam had burst, unleashing years of suppressed pain and injustice. Late that night, I stared at the flurry of social media notifications and felt an odd mixture of triumph and sorrow. My marriage was destroyed, but that was a small price to pay compared to what Mark and his father had done to others. For once, they couldn't bury the truth under piles of money and twisted lies. I was still scared about what tomorrow might bring, but I also felt a fierce sense of relief. In that moment, I knew the shadows I'd been living in were finally giving way to the light of day. It wasn't just my fight anymore, it was a community reckoning. And together, we were reclaiming our voices. Little did I realize, one final confrontation still awaited, one that would seal Mark's fate and grant me the closure I needed. I found out the news from a late-night phone call. The police had arrested Mark after he violated the protective order and tried to corner me at my workplace. I wasn't there at the time. My boss, who knew about the situation, had allowed me to work remotely that day. When Mark showed up unannounced, employees recognized him from the recent media coverage and called security. By the time the officers arrived, he was raging about setting the record straight, refusing to leave until he saw me. They handcuffed him right in the lobby. That phone call felt surreal, but also like a blessing. He was finally facing real consequences. In the weeks that followed, he was released on bail, but the conditions were strict. Meanwhile, I pressed forward with the divorce. My attorney hammered out terms that granted me not only financial support, but also the promise of no further contact. Mark's father tried to step in, offering me a sizable sum to drop everything, to stop ruining their family name in the public eye. But I refused. I told my lawyer to keep up the pressure. The hush money scandal had grown into a full-blown investigation by the authorities, targeting both Mark and his father. Their fortress of secrets was collapsing piece by piece. One crisp afternoon, I was asked to give a statement. I arrived at the courthouse with Heather and my sister by my side, nerves buzzing. Sitting in that stark hallway, I felt flashes of memory, Mark's sweet smiles, our wedding day, the illusions I once believed. I had loved him so purely, never suspecting he could tear my life apart. But now, I was testifying to everything he'd done. My hands trembled as I spoke into the microphone, recounting the gaslighting, the affair, and the threats. It was emotionally draining, but also liberating. Telling my story in such a public, official setting was a final act of reclamation. I was no longer a victim trapped in Mark's world. I was a survivor determined to ensure he couldn't harm anyone else. Eventually, Mark agreed to a plea deal on lesser charges related to harassment and breaching the restraining order. His father faced separate penalties for financial misconduct and obstruction of justice. Though they both managed to avoid lengthy prison time, thanks to high-priced lawyers, the damage to their reputation was irreversible. People in Willow Creek no longer saw them as respected community members, but as cautionary tales of how power can corrupt. The day my divorce was finalized, I walked out of the courtroom feeling almost weightless. My father pulled me into a hug, tears in his eyes as he apologized once again for not warning me sooner. I told him I forgave him, not just for his silence, but for believing that keeping the truth hidden was safer than honesty. My Aunt Karen gave me a knowing nod, her eyes brimming with relief. Heather and Laura clapped like I'd just won a marathon, and in a sense, I had. Standing on the courthouse steps, I breathed in the crisp air and felt genuine hope for the future. Yes, I still had emotional scars to heal. Yes, I still felt a pang of sorrow over how my marriage had ended, but there was a sweet release in knowing that Mark's power over me was gone. I was free to rebuild my life on my own terms, surrounded by people who cared about me enough to tell me the truth, no matter how painful. I learned many lessons through this ordeal: the importance of trusting my instincts, the necessity of speaking up even when it's frightening, and the strength we discover when we refuse to be silenced. Mark once tried to shatter my sense of self, but in the process, he only revealed how strong I could be when I chose to fight back. If anyone listening to my story ever finds themselves doubting their reality or sense that something is off in their relationships, I hope they remember this. Never let anyone take away your voice. Seek help, gather evidence, and don't be afraid to stand your ground, because sometimes stepping out of the shadows is the only way to truly live. And now, as I close this chapter of my life, I feel a serenity I never thought possible. I may carry the memories of betrayal, but I also carry the proof that I could rise above it. The quiet nights are once again calm, and the morning sun feels like a promise of better days to come. I'm no longer Emily Harper, the woman trapped by her husband's lies. I'm Emily Harper, survivor and champion of my own destiny. And that is the most liberating feeling in the world.